Today I'm driving the 2011 Impala, and I've got a pretty good video lined up. I'm pretty excited about it. Not too long ago there was a video on a channel called ProjectFarm about a product called Motorkote, and you guys should check out that channel because the guy on there does a really good job on all the products that he reviews, and he does it very scientifically, very unbiased, so you got a really honest account of the products and whether they stand up to the claims they make, basically. So he did a video on this stuff called Motorkote, and Motorkote claims that it's not an additive, but I'm going to call it one because I don't know what else to call it. So it's an additive that you put in your engine oil and your tranny oil and basically anything you want to put it in, any kind of fluid that lubricates. You can add this stuff to it, apparently, and water won't wash it away, they say. And so this ProjectFarm video that evaluated Motorkote, he has a lubricity tester which uses a spinning race and a bearing to evaluate film strength and lubricating qualities of different fluids. And he tested this stuff against motor oil, and it just, it was amazing. It passed with flying colors. It was definitely superior to engine oil alone, and even when mixed with engine oil, it was definitely much better than just running straight oil. So, and he also put it in a lawnmower engine too. Ran it with like no oil in the crankcase, just water, I think, and it even managed to survive that sort of destructive testing with this Motorkote treatment, having been done beforehand. So with all of this testing that he did, and all the amazing results that came out of that, it kind of inspired me to do this video, and the purpose of this is to take that knowledge and build on it, and try to go to the next step, intuitively, and try to see how I can bring that information a little bit closer to the customer in a more tangible way that will have some meaning to the everyday driver or the performance enthusiast, for that matter. So what I want to do is I want to look at two things. I want to look at mileage and I want to look at power. And when I look at mileage, it's also going to translate in some sense into cost. I want to do an A to B comparison between the pre-treated and the post-treated condition, and see how mileage is going to improve or not improve, and how power is going to increase or not increase. And if we have information like that, it'll be really valuable, I think, because then your average customer going to the store and buying this Motorkote product will have a pretty good idea of what they're going to get for their money, and how quickly that investment is going to pay for itself. Because Motorkote is not cheap, but at the same time, when you think about the long-term savings or the horsepower that you're going to get out of it, assuming that it works, I would say it stands to be more than worth the cost. So that's what we're going to try to find out today.
Let's have a quick look at the vehicle and the systems we're going to be testing. First and foremost, we're going to evaluate baseline fuel economy. We'll set the cruise control and measure the mileage between two fixed points on the highway. After the Motorkote treatment, we'll do it again and compare the results. Once we get a baseline pull off the dyno, we'll begin adding Motorkote to various mechanical subsystems where friction accounts for significant power losses. First, we'll add Motorkote to the engine oil, where it will lubricate the cams, lifters, rods, and several other moving parts. We'll then add Motorkote to the automatic transmission. It contains a planetary gear set, so there are a lot of metal surfaces meshing under torque and suffering frictional losses. Next, we'll add Motorkote to the steering fluid, where it will lubricate the rack and pinion. In addition to fluids, we're also going to directly lubricate certain mechanical parts, such as the wheel bearings. These bearings support the entire weight of the vehicle and should benefit from the additional lubrication. Finally, we'll add some Motorkote to as many pulley bearings as we can access on the engine's accessory drive. These subsystems should benefit from a reduced coefficient of friction, and the gains should be realized as increased power on the dyno and improved mileage on the highway, if the product works as advertised.
Okay guys, we're getting ready to do part A, the mileage test here. This is before the Motorkote treatment, and we got a full tank of gas. We got everything's just sort of coming up to temperature. Got all the fluids and everything getting warmed up and stabilized, and then we're going to begin So we're just going to pick a fixed point on the highway, measure the mileage for a certain distance, and then we'll basically end the test and then redo it after the Motorkote treatment and compare results. So we're just coming up to that point now. Ready, and begin. Getting about 23 miles a gallon. The road's pretty flat. There's another bridge coming up ahead. Based on the lay of the land here, I don't think we're going to need to do this for very long to get a consistent measurement. I'll just consider these two bridges the checkpoints, and we'll just take the mileage between them. The bridge is coming up in about half a click. Okay, getting ready to stop the test here. Doing 24 miles a gallon, 23 again. Okay, here's the bridge. Ready, and test over. Okay, it's after the dyno, and now we're going to begin the Motorkote treatment, and I'm going to start by adding 8 ounces of Motorkote to the transmission fluid. I've got the 8 ounces already poured out into this container here, and I'm going to try to use a funnel to get it through the dipstick. I'm just hoping I don't spill any, so bear with me while I awkwardly pour this fluid. Well, that's not as bad as I thought it would be. Okay. Looks like I got it all. Didn't spill much. Actually, it looks like I didn't spill any. But I probably just jinxed myself. I had to pull, I should comment, I had to pull some transmission fluid out earlier on because the dipstick was reading a little high, even for what should have been in there. So in order to make space for this extra fluid, I needed to pull some out, and I just used a hose through the dipstick to do that. It's not really a good idea to overfill your transmission fluid because it could foam, it could increase transmission line pressure, and that could cause leaks. There's a whole bunch of problems if it's too high. Adding a little bit's probably not a big deal. This thing here apparently holds 12 or 13 liters, the entire system, and I'm only adding 8 ounces, so that's actually less than the ratio you're supposed to add by a little bit, but I don't think the transmission is going to need that much. I'm more concerned about adding it to the engine oil. So now I'm going to do the power steering, and for power steering I had a little bit of trouble determining what the capacity of the reservoir is, but most of the references I looked at, the general consensus seems to be about a quart. So some people say 2 quarts, but I'm going to err on the side of caution and assume that it's 1 quart, in which case you need only 1 ounce of Motorkote, which isn't that much. You can see it's hardly anything. So I'm just going to add that now, and even if it's a little bit less than what it's supposed to be, it should make a notable difference. Now I'm going to use this plastic pipette full of Motorkote to try to specifically target the bearings on the accessory belt. I won't be able to get all of them, but I'm going to do my best to try to access at least some of them and try to lubricate those, and just be careful not to get any on the belt itself, because you don't want to make the belt slip, you just want to make the bearings nice and slippery. So we're moving on to the engine treatment portion, and this is the 16 ounces that I'm going to be putting into the engine.
We're putting in some Motorkote here as a trial test on engine performance for Dyno result.
So here we are, I've got the wheel all apart, and I just wanted to show you what this looks like. So ordinarily you would remove the brake caliper, and then the brake caliper is over here, right? You would remove the rotor, and then behind the rotor and caliper, once you get those out of the way, is the wheel bearing itself. And the wheel bearing is held on, in this case, with this large center nut here. So in my particular car, in this particular car, the wheel bearing is not the type that you can easily disassemble to actually get to the guts inside where the bearings actually are, where the balls are. And that's the part that actually needs the lubrication. The rest of it is kind of sealed, so you can't really effectively lubricate it from the outside. You have to remove the portion of the wheel bearing that encloses the inner race and the bearings themselves to get in there. In this case, it's not going to be practical for me to do that, but in a lot of other vehicles where the bearing is of a different design, there'll be like a cap or something in the middle, and you'll be able to actually remove that with a pulley tool. There are certain puller tools that you can use to get that center portion out, and then you can see the inside of the bearing, and that's usually packed with grease, and you can get some Motorkote into that. In this case, because it's not practical to do that, and I didn't anticipate that being a mitigating factor here, I'm going to have to either skip this part of the treatment, or maybe I can find something that needs lubrication in this area. But really the only other part would be the CV joint. The CV joint is protected by these boots, and if you could get inside the CV joint and lubricate that would definitely help with mileage and power. But again, that's sealed by these rings here, and you need a tool to get those off as well. So this might be something that you could follow up on your own, but basically that's what you could lubricate if you were so inclined to try to further reduce drivetrain losses. But I think that considering what we've done with this car so far, it's had quite a bit of treatment already. So anything that the product is going to do should already be quite apparent. looks like we gained a little bit so far. Back on the highway again. This is after the Motorkote treatment, so we're doing part B of the mileage test. And begin. Second bridge is coming up in about half a click, just like before. I'll let you know. Here we go, test is almost over. And finish. Okay, so I'll have to check the video, but it looks like we did see a material gain in mileage. I think before we had 23, 24 miles per gallon, and this time we saw upwards of 26 and 27. So definitely an improvement there.
So here I have tabulated all of the data that we conducted for the part A and part B of the mileage test. And what I did was, because I was relying on the car's mileage calculator and not any kind of instrument that I had brought, I had to basically videotape the mileage calculator on the car, and then go back through the video later and do an Excel chart so that I would basically make an XY plot with time on one axis and mileage on the other axis, so that every time the mileage changed on the screen, I would update that information, and that way I could make this plot that you see here. So that way you can sort of average all of the data points and come up with a test average based on how much time the car remained at a given mileage. So if the car stayed at 25 miles per gallon for 10 seconds, for example, that would give that mileage a certain weighting, and then that weighting could be used in combination with all the other data points to come up with an average. So that's what I did, and the results are basically that before the Motorkote treatment, we had 24.25 mile per gallon fuel economy, and then after the treatment, under the exact same conditions, we had a 26.41 mile per gallon. So an improvement of 2.16 mile per gallon, and that translates into an extra 32 miles approximately, given a 15-gallon tank. So if you fill your tank up and you have a 15-gallon tank, you're gonna get an extra 32 miles out of that tank after applying the Motorkote. And that translates into a savings of about $3.34 if you take the current gas prices. The national average is what I took. And that, again, if you extrapolate that to an annual savings, it gives you about $111 US. The Motorkote, what it cost me to do the treatment, I didn't use the entire bottle. I used about 3/4 of the bottle. So it cost me about $20 worth of fluid. So if you subtract that from your savings, you get about $90 US. Now, because I did this test in Canada, it cost me a lot more for gas here than it does in the States. So that the savings for me for this car, given its fuel capacity and all the usage of the car and all that, turns out to be more like $350 actually total savings. But this is more of a conservative estimate because gas prices are cheaper in the States, and not everyone drives a big car with a big fuel tank, and not everyone drives as much, as another person might. So this you can consider to be a fairly conservative estimate. But given that you're making about $90 US a year, it more than covers the price of the product, although not by a whole lot. But if you want the extra pocket change and you don't mind adding this stuff to your car, then I see no reason not to. There are a couple of things that I find curious that might prompt further study. First of all, I don't know how much of a break-in period you might need to get the maximum effect from the product. Based on how busy the day was, and I was trying to squeeze everything into one day so that all the to make the test controlled so that nothing would change from one day to the other. I wanted to get everything fit into one day. So I kind of had time against me, and I didn't get a chance to really properly break in the vehicle. I put maybe, 10 miles on the car after treating it with Motorkote just to make sure all the fluids were circulating, but I don't know if that is going to give you the maximum benefit. So these numbers could have improved possibly if I had waited longer. The other thing too is just that I don't know how RPM or load affects the test. So maybe had I done this at a different speed, not on the highway but on a main road or something, it would have given different results. I mean, what I can tell you is that losses are not the same with respect to load point and with respect to vehicle speed. They do change. So had I done the test at a different condition, it might have been different. Who knows? This is just something that I consider to be relevant to the daily driver, because highway conditions are what a lot of us see most of the time with our cars, and that's where you spend most of your miles. Looking at the dyno results, I was unable to get an electronic copy of the graphs, but I did get printouts, and I was able to do some chart analysis with just a couple of rulers, and I tabulated as much of the data as I could into Excel and regraphed them so that I could do some proper analysis on the numbers. And in all honesty, the results are a little bit inconclusive. I have a bit of conjecture, which I'll get into, but they're not, jumping out at you. It's a little unclear what effect, if any, the Motorkote may have had. Starting with the first chart, this shows you the stock car before it was treated with the Motorkote, and you're looking at the first and second pulls superimposed on the same graph, with torque on the top, which is the descending curve, and horsepower on the bottom, which is rising. As you can see, they're fairly close together, a little bit of a gap, which is not uncommon. Looking at the second chart, which is the average of the two curves, you see a very well-behaved curve, which is pretty much what you would expect. The problem is when we move on to the Motorkote graphs. So the first graph shows, again, the two pulls made after the Motorkote treatment, and they're superimposed again with torque on the top and horsepower on the bottom. Once again, we see that slight variation between the two pulls. And what's interesting to note is that unlike the first two graphs for the stock vehicle, this one here seems to start off higher and trend lower. Like, it doesn't have a peak that you can see on the graph. It seems to have a peak that wasn't recorded, which is interesting because one of the problems with dynoing a automatic transmission vehicle is that the automatic transmission tends to shift on its own during the dyno pull, which you don't want it to do. You want it to stay in a given gear, usually third gear, or whatever gear has 1-to-1 gear ratio. So, you know, the Impala has a console shifter that you can put into third gear, but it allows lower gears as well. It just doesn't allow you to go into fourth. So if you gun it in third gear, it'll usually downshift. So I think because of that, the operator had to do this pull in second gear. It had to do all the pulls in second gear, which is not a problem. But what else happens is that, and again, in order for the operator to make sure the car behaves itself and doesn't do anything weird, they have to bring the RPMs up to a pretty high value before the pull will actually record, or before they can put their foot right, you know, all the way down on the accelerator, which is, you know, the sign for the software to start recording. So in all cases, I think he had to bring it up to about 4,000 RPM before it would record. So you're missing 2,000 to 4,000. Which is not usually a big deal because not a lot of power is usually made in that regime. But with these old cars, with these iron blocks, you know, these old pushrod engines, they tend to make power, or they tend to make torque a lot lower in the RPM range. So in this case, it looks like we're actually missing the torque peak because peak torque was actually before 3,900, it looks like. So the question then is, you know, what was the peak torque? It recorded as high as 211 foot-pounds, but, you know, could it have gone to 215? We don't really know, unfortunately. And all we can do is sort of extrapolate, but that's not really scientific to do that. So we just have to sort of work with the data that we have. So moving on to the next graph, again, we've averaged the two runs, the two pulls. So you can see again that characteristic falling pattern right from the beginning with no visible peak. And then finally on the last graph, I've overlaid the average from before and after the Motorkote treatment. And this is really the key most graph, I think, because this really tells the story, you know, with all things being equal and, you know, fairly comparing before and after, this one tells you if there's any notable difference of, you know, of statistical significance. And what I see is that basically from, I want to say 4,900 or 5,000 RPM onward, there is no statistical difference between the two runs. They're basically identical. They intersect multiple times, basically right on top of each other. However, before that, I would say 4,800 and prior to that, there is a consistent gap in the power band that goes all the way back to the beginning of when the dyno recorded, which is interesting. It's not a big gap, so again, it could just be attributed to dyno error or vehicle error or whatever, but I tend to think that it isn't. That's my gut feeling. I think that gap isn't just random. I think that this diverging gap, because the further you go back in the graph, the further apart the lines tend to get. And I think that divergence is not just a mistake, but that it's of statistical significance, and that if we had collected data prior to 3,900 RPM, we might have seen that trend continue and actually get larger, which actually suggests that as the car becomes more limited by airflow, which is usually what happens at high RPMs, then the efficiency gains that you get are no longer relevant, or they're no longer high enough a percentage to affect the power band. So this is very interesting to me, and I would very much like to see what the earlier portion of the graph actually looked like. And one other hypothesis that I have, which you know, I don't know whether this is true or not. I would have to investigate further, but one hypothesis that I have is that the areas of the car that were treated with Motorkote were all related, or were mostly related to adding it to a fluid that had a lot of viscous properties to it. So engine oil, transmission oil, power steering fluid, they're all meant to be viscous, high shear fluids that sort of provide a cushion for contacting mechanical parts. But the problem with viscous fluids is that the shear between the molecules in the fluid itself produce losses. There's a lot of heat energy lost just by the fluid shearing against itself as it flows around these mechanical parts. So even if you reduce the friction between the metal parts, so metal to metal contact friction is reduced, you're going to have some gains that are associated with that friction, with that reduction in friction. But what you're not going to see is any sort of an improvement in the viscous losses, because the viscosity of the fluid is still there. You're still getting that shear, and that's never going to go away as a result of reducing metal to metal friction. That's just another animal altogether. So the question now is, of the 20% drivetrain losses that you would normally expect in an automatic transmission, or the 15% that you would expect from a manual, for example, how much of that 20 or 15% is purely frictional losses between contacting metal parts, and how much of it is related to viscous losses? Especially in a torque converter, you've got a lot of viscous losses because the turbine and the fluid going through the turbine, it's just churning in there and just shearing against itself and producing a lot of heat and energy losses without actually there being any mechanical contact. So that's kind of a hypothesis that I have that might explain why we didn't see a bigger difference here. But the mileage test shows a different story. So clearly, there are some gains as a result of the Motorkote treatment, but they're not manifesting themselves as increase in torque and power, at least not at the higher RPMs. There seems to be some effect on the lower RPMs, but how much of this is attributed directly to the properties of Motorkote are indeterminate. And without a dyno that shows a more complete power band, we wouldn't know whether this trend that appears to be there on the graph would continue, or whether it would just sort of, end up being a glitch that where the lines would coincide again at lower RPMs. We don't know. But anyway, just to wrap up the test, I would say that Motorkote definitely does have a positive effect on the vehicle. Very minute benefit for power, but definitely a significant benefit for mileage. So just because of the mileage component, you might want to consider buying this just to save yourself a few bucks every year in gas charges. And on top of that, it might also increase the longevity of your vehicle, because you won't have as much metal being worn away in the different gears and pistons and cylinder walls and all of that stuff. So it probably will increase the life of the engine, if nothing more, engine, transmission, all of that. And one of the side benefits is a bit of extra fuel economy. And again, because we don't know how this product gets better or worse over time, there may be gains or losses that are unrealized as yet until we do a follow-up test, maybe sometime in the future, to see what the longer term effects of this product are.